Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chagigah daf kaf. A few short announcements. First of all, there's a sheet today of the usual study guide, but I did the first chart, which is a really important chart. I translated it into English, which has all the different levels of tuma and tahara. Okay, so that's really important because it will give you the background. Whenever you can always keep this chart. I'll try to use the same chart and put it up on the sheets when we needed another dapim in the future, but it's a really good, maybe try to remember that on Chagigah daf 20, there's a study guide that has the avatuma, the first degree, the second degree, all the details of them. Again, I can't say it's all the details. I try to include as many details as I could. There's always more, and there's all these Rabbanit additions, etc. But I included as a lot of the basics, so that should help you. The next thing I want to remind everyone is the Siyum is next Tuesday. And if you're in Israel, there's Siyumim in Hebrew around the country on Monday. There's also a Zoom for the Hebrew. And as usual, the English will be Zoomed around the world. It will be at 8:30 as usual, and in the evening Israel time. And if you haven't yet done your tapestry, your video or a picture with your description of your story or your favorite Gemara quote, please do it now. We've gotten a lot of responses. We want to really build it up and have a lot of women from all around the world and their stories. So please go into our site and do it. Okay. This month's Shiurim were sponsored by Heather Stone in loving memory of her father, Robert Stone. Yehuda Leib ben Naftali Halevi B'chaya, Zichrono Livracha, passed away on the 21st of Adar Rishon. He lived his Jewish values, blending them with his fierce belief in democracy and feminism. Today's daf is sponsored by Ariella Slovin in honor of her mother, Rena Slovin's birthday. With love from her 3 children and their spouses, we are so impressed by her unwavering dedication to Daf Yomi, which reflects her dedication to Jewish education and Jewish practice. We love you. Today's daf is sponsored by Ricky and Alan Zibit in loving memory of Alan's mother, Helen Zibit, Henya Bat Yaakov, and Rachel Leah. On her 22nd year at side, Mom loved Israel and learning and would have been active in Daf Yomi. Today's daf is finally last sponsorship, sponsored in honor of Miriam Tannenbaum on her English birthday. In honor of her dear mother, thank you for being a role model in everything you do, whether your students, your family, your aspirations, or Torah. Really, Bo Shamro, your full heart and effort, efforts are felt always. We love you. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. So we ended with this line that really requires a lot of explanation. So I'm going to explain it now much more in depth. Okay, Rav Mary says, Shmamina, chulin shenasu atarat hakodesh kikodesh dan. Rav Mary says we can infer from our Mishnah that chulin that were done, that were treated. Okay, there were people. Remember, we talked about prushim. Prushim are people who keep their chulin as if we have to. Chulin means not sanctified. That means you don't, non-sacred items. You don't need to worry if they become impure. However, what we talked about in the Mishnah, and this is a little bit different from what we're going to see here. In the Mishnah, where we said you have to wash your hands for chulin, why do you have to wash your hands for chulin? Who cares if they become tamei? They're not sacred. But those were prushim who decided that we're going to basically treat all items as if laws of purity and impurity relate to them. And therefore, we're going to wash our hands every time before we eat. Now, what's important to understand is that's treating chulin like chulin, not like something else. It's basically saying we're going to keep laws of impurity even though there really aren't. Because remember, once you have a food that's a sheni, right, or your hands are a sheni, remember the rabbi said your hands are a sheni, it only can pass on impurity to truma, which is a shlishi. But those people said, no, we're going to treat it as if it could contract impurity. Okay, that's regular chulin. Now we have people who go a step farther and they say, we want to treat it like kodshim. We want to say it can get to 4th degree impurity. Now, normally if I have a house and in my house, I have something that's a sheni, okay, I have food, let's say, that became, okay, let's say I'm a nida, in the time where I'm menstruating, I'm tme'ah, I'm an avatuma. I touch a vessel, okay, I touch a bowl. That bowl becomes a rishon, because I'm an av, that becomes a rishon. The food inside it becomes a sheni, and that's it. It doesn't go farther than that, okay? And the truth is, if I'm not, it doesn't really matter. I can eat it. It's not a problem, right? There's nothing wrong with it. But if I'm a prushi and it's tamei, I'm going to basically say that's problematic. That's what we're talking about in the Mishnah, about washing hands and things like that, right? We want to avoid, we want to treat, we don't want to deal with impurities in our house. Okay, that's like a higher level. But now, and then if that food in that vessel touches something else, nothing happens. Why does nothing happen? Because Shlishi is only if it's truma or sacrificial meat. There is no such thing as third degree impurity that passes on. So if I'm in my house, even if let's say I don't want to have things that are impure, but some food became impure, okay, level of sheni, it doesn't pass on to anything else. Nothing happens at that point because that's the end game, okay? We're going to talk about this end game a lot. That's the end game, right? Truma end game is at 3, third degree. At kodshim, it's at 4th degree. But chulin are at 2nd degree. That's the end of it. But if I decide that I'm extra stringent, and even though I'm not eating sacrificial foods, but I say, you know what? I'm going to treat my chulin, shenasu al taharat hakodesh, I'm going to treat it like it's sacrificial foods. Well, in that case, kikodesh dami, that means that same food is going to touch other food. And a minute ago, it didn't pass on impurity because I didn't treat it like this. Now it's going to pass on impurity to the food it touches. It's going to go to shlishi and it's going to go to revi. It can go to 4th degree just by my treating it as if it's kodesh. Okay, now that's a chiddush. That's not obvious because you might say, okay, you can treat things stringently, but what? This is like what we talked about tumas a while back. We said that it's something that's, if I, let's say, cause your items to become impure, so that's damage that's not seen, right? And the food looks the same that touched this food, right? Whether it's tameh or not, we don't need, you have to know that something happened. Otherwise, that's part of our problem here, is that no one even knows whether things happened or not. And that's why we have to be extra careful and assume. Presumption is that actually someone impure did touch it. But what happens here is something that happens in a different world, really. In other words, the same food touched the other food. If I decide I'm going to treat it like kodesh, then impurity is going to pass on 2 more degrees. But if I don't treat it that way, then nothing happens. It doesn't cause impurity at all. So it's kind of a strange thing, although that's the way Tuma works, okay? And that's what he says can be inferred from our Mishnah. The question is, where in our Mishnah can that be inferred? So the Gemara is going to suggest one option, then they're going to reject it and find another way where Rav Mary gets this from. Mimai, where do you get this from? Midelo katane behu ma'ala. From the fact that there is no listing. Remember, there were different levels. There was chulin, truma, kodesh, chatat. So now also maser sheni, but let's ignore that for right now because that's not really one of these levels we're discussing. But anyway, you could say chulin, maser sheni, okay? It doesn't say there anywhere chulin shenasu al taharat kodesh as if it has its own level. So they assume, even though you might say that's not a good assumption, but we'll get back to that in a second, which is why the Gemara is going to reject this. They assume that means, since there's no extra level, it must be if I treat my chulin, my non-sacred items, like kodesh, has a status of kodesh, and that's why it's not mentioned as a separate thing. It just falls into the kodesh category. To which the Gemara says, what do you mean? That's not a good proof. Dilma hay delo katani b'hu ma'ala idamu l'truma hatani truma v'idamu l'chulin hatani l'chulin. It could be one of many options that are listed in the Mishnah. You could say chulin that I treat like kodesh maybe doesn't get the high status of kodesh. Maybe it goes down one level. It gets the status of truma. Maybe it's actually still like chulin, meaning you can't turn things into shlishi or revi'i. It's not mentioned in the Mishnah because it falls into one of those categories, but it's certainly not clear which category it falls into. And not only that, why would we think that this is a bad proof? And theoretically, it could be more like chulin or like truma, because ditnan, it says in the Mishnah in Taharot, chulin shenasu al taharat hakodesh harehin kechulin. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Tzadok omer harehin ketruma. There you have a machloket, and neither of them says what Rav Mary said. Okay, which that in and of itself seems to be a question of Rav Mary, although the Gemara for some reason doesn't seem concerned with that. But basically, maybe because you'll just say our Mishnah has a different approach. Okay, and that must be the answer to that question. But the fact that it's not listed here doesn't mean that it could fall into the Kodesh category. You need a better proof than that, because we even have 2 other Tanaim who one says it's like Truma, one says it's like Chulin, which means that you could just say it didn't specify in the Mishnah because it's either Chulin or it's Truma. Bad proof. So let's try another proof. Elami Seifa. Maybe it's learned from the second part, which is Yossi ben Yoezer Haya Chasid Shebekuna. This case isn't going to be relevant. We're bringing this really because of the next one. But Yosef ben Yoezer, remember, he was a Kohen. This was to prove this halacha we saw earlier, that Kohanim were not as careful about making sure that a Nida or someone else who could be Matami Tumat Midras would, right, touch something or all that. So they were very careful for their truma, but they weren't as careful as those who eat sacrificial foods. And therefore, if you want to eat sacrificial foods and this mitpachat, which remember the mitpachat that someone sat on if they were a nida, becomes an avatuma, that means if I touch it, I'll become a rishon. So that would be pretty much a problem. I wouldn't be able to eat kodesh. So the mitpachat, or if the mitpachat, let's say, touch the kodesh, right, we have to assume it was impure. Okay, that's not relevant yet. The next one is very relevant because the second case that was brought in the Mishnah was Yochanan ben Gudgada, who was a regular prushi. He wasn't a Kohen. He wasn't eating sacrificial meat. And let's see what happened with him. Haya ochel al taharat hakodesh. He treated, that's exactly the case Rav Mary's talking about. He treated all of his non-sacred items as if they were like sacrificial foods. Kol yamav, okay, all the days of his life. And even though he was super, super careful, anything that someone could have potentially sat on in his house, if it was related to anything that had to do with the mechatat, the paraduma waters, then it would be a problem. But what do you see from here? Lechatat it was a problem for chatat, but lekodesh lo. But it was totally fine for kodesh. So what do you see here? Alma kasavar chulin shenasol taharat hakodesh ki kodesh tami. Anyone who treats their non-sacred items as kodesh, it doesn't exactly prove it directly, but it's not talking about exactly the issue we were talking about, that you could pass it on to a shlishi and a revi. But the point is, once someone treats things like kodesh, he gets all the halachas of kodesh. This can, right? If someone else is actually eating sacrificial meat and his cloth got in contact with them, we're not worried, because by treating things as if they're kodesh, you're basically at that level. So that proves with the food as well. Okay, so that's first section of today's stuff. Second section, which is going to basically take us till the end of the chapter, which is on the next, when we turn the page, is these three laws. And we're going to get a little bit sidetracked from this, but we're going to see these three laws, and they're all in the context of what we call hesech hadat. Hesech hadat means I stop thinking about something. Okay, my mind, now the idea here, and again, it's very hard to imagine the reality here, but it seems like people had to be conscious all the time about whether something came in contact with someone impure or something impure. You can imagine, right? It's a crazy way to live, but they had to think about these things all the time. And if you have some lapse of thought, it's the best definition I could come up with of hesech hadat, a lapse in your thought, then we have to assume that, and it's generally people would watch items from becoming impure. So if you had a lapse of thought about something, then we're going to assume that something could have happened then. You missed it and it became impure. So now, Rabbi Yonatan ben Elazar, we're going to have three halachot. I'll already tell you that there's a mix here of Tanaim and Amoraim. Okay, maybe lapse of attention. That's a good one, actually. Thanks, Caroline. Maybe lapse of attention is good. Some are Amoraim, some are Tanaim, even though Amoraim are from the very early time period, or like right in the crossover between Tanaim and Amoraim, or one of them, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Tzadok, who we just saw a minute ago, is a Tana, actually, from an earlier Tana. Anyway, so we're talking mix a little bit of, right? Usually they have a Tanaitic source or an Amora. This is a bit of a mix. In any case, three halachot that are similar. Amar Rabbi Yonatan ben Elazar, nafla ma'aparto hemenu. Some sort of scarf. I had a scarf on my head or on my shoulders, and it fell off. Amar l'chavero tnali. And I asked you, can you please pick it up for me? Unitanalo, and you gave it to me. Okay, seems like a very simple action. Tme'ah, even though all the while it was on my head, I was watching and being careful of it. As soon as it falls off and I ask you to get it, that's considered a lapse of attention. I'm no longer thinking about it, okay? Because you picked it up. It's a little bit strange. I'm right there. I'm watching it. And the Gemara is going to get back to us and say, what do you, it does seem strange. I'm watching it. What do you mean? So it's called a lapse of attention, and we assume that it became tamei in the interim. Next case. Amar Rabbi Yonatan ben Amr, nitchafu lo kelim shel Shabbat bekelim shel chol ulevasham nitmeu. If I thought it was regular weekday clothing, and then it turns out it was Shabbat clothing, and I was watching it from impurities, well, if I put them on, they were going to be considered as if they're tamei. Okay, why? It's even if I didn't put them on, but the point is that I thought they were big day chol. I thought they were everyday clothes. Now, Rashi is going to say that people treated their Shabbat clothes, very interesting, with a higher level of being careful about impurity. So since I thought that they were weekday clothes, I didn't treat them with the same type of shmirah right, we all know when you watch something, there's ways to watch things and there's ways to watch things. Some people watch more carefully. Sometimes you watch more carefully. So if I thought they were Bigdei Shabbat, I would have kept a very high level. In this case, I thought they were weekday clothes. So I kind of watched them, but not as much. So when I realized that they're Bigdei Shabbat, they're considered impure because I didn't watch them the way I would normally watch Bigdei Shabbat. Okay, all these halachot seem a little bit strange, and the Gemara is going to basically question them because I was watching them still, why should this be considered impure? And Amar Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok, our third one, Maaseh b'shtei nashim. This is kind of a funny situation that you can almost imagine. Chaverot, they were friends. Shenitchafu lahem kleihem bebeit hamerchatz, right? You go swimming at the pool, you leave your clothes on the side, you come back and you see the pile and you think that they're your clothes. The truth is you have to consider if they went and they left them. It's a little bit strange, but maybe they were there the whole time near their clothes. But I thought, right, maybe let's say the bathing thing is right near your clothes and your clothes are in vision. And all the while I thought that I put my clothes in one spot and it turns out those were your clothes and you thought your clothes were in that spot. It turns out they were my clothes and we got confused whose clothes were who. When I figured out, oh, those are my clothes, not those. Well, now it's Hasei Chadat, even though I was watching your clothes and you were watching my clothes, but somehow this doesn't work. These are all called lapse of attention. So now, Matkefla Rabbi Yoshai, we're going to have one question. We're going to start dealing with this question and kind of getting sidetracked with it. And then we're going to come back and have another question much later in the daf. So Matkefla Rabbi Yoshai, Elameata. So, okay, based on what you guys are saying, he says, Hoshit yado lasal, lito pat chitim, ba'alta biyado pat se'olim. If I had a basket and I thought it was wheat bread and it turned out it was barley bread, Hachinami dinitmate. Are you going to say that that's impure? Because again, it was a lapse of attention. Just like I thought it was my clothes, it turns out it was your clothes. I thought it was this kind of bread, it turns out it was a different kind of bread. Are you going to say that bread is impure, even though I have my mind all the time on the bread, thinking it was wheat bread? And if you're going to tell me, yeah, you're right, it is tameh based on all the things everyone said, well, I'm going to bring you a braita that seems to indicate no, it wouldn't be. If you're watching your barrel, thinking that in that barrel is wine, but it turns out it was oil. So again, you thought it was one thing, it turned out it was something else. Maybe like the Bigdei Shabbat and the Bigdei Chol. You were watching it all the while. It's pure from passing on impurity. Okay, that's a weird language, and we're going to get back to this. Pure from passing on impurity. The main part they want to say right now is, look, your shmirah worked because it's pure, at least from something, right? From passing on impurity. So it worked, even though you thought it was something and it turned out it was something else. And you should call that lapse of attention based on the cases we saw previously. To which the Gemara says, well, it's not exactly totally pure. So they start counter questioning and they say, you didn't read till the end. What does it say at the end? But you can't eat this shemen because it actually is tameh. So what does it mean it's tameh, but it's tahorami l'tameh? So amai, why is that? Why does it have this split? It's a little bit strange. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah be'omer. It's a case, okay, this is what we're going to call an ukimta. He says, and we're going to see this a few times today, in ukimta is when you say, it's not just any random case. It's a unique case where the following thing happened, even though it didn't say so. Okay? It's when a Mora comes up to a Tanaitic source and says something doesn't make sense here. Really doesn't make sense to understand this simply, because how did you explain that it's pure from passing on impurity, but it itself becomes impure? Well, how could that be? It must be ba'omer shmartia midavar hamitam'a velo midavar hapasla. Okay, what does that mean? It means I did a partial kind of shmirah. It's a case where the person said, listen, I made sure that this barrel didn't come in contact with something that would have caused it to become impure at a level that it could still pass on impurity. Meaning, I made sure it wasn't a rishon, okay? Because a rishon can pass on impurity to a sheni. So I protected it from any avatuma, or I'm not going to get into all the details of possible situations where it could become tameh to the extent where it could pass on impurity. I watched it from that. What didn't I watch it from? I didn't watch it from lomi davar haposla, not from something that could disqualify it, meaning it could become a second degree impurity. Okay, one of the examples is if a tful yom touches it, the rabbis decreed that it becomes a sheni, but it can't pass on impurity. A tful yom is someone who went to the mikveh in the morning. It's kind of in between Tuma and Tara. Okay, it basically, the person went to the mikveh in the morning, but has to wait for the sunset to be entirely pure, but they did go to the mikveh already. They come in contact with something, they can disqualify it, but it doesn't pass on impurity after that. This is very similar to something we saw and we're going to see in the next Mishnah. We'll see it today, which is truma, right? Normally when you have a second degree impurity, it passes on to truma, right? And it passes on to kodshim. There could be shlishi for both. But the difference is when it comes to truma, that's the end game. Remember, we talked about the end game. So what does this mean? It means they always use the language posla. It disqualifies the truma, which means that's the end game. It can't pass on impurity from there, though. And it's mitame, the kodshim, because the kodshim still have one more level they can go. So that's what we mean when posla. Posla means it itself becomes tameh, but it can't pass on impurity. So again, in a very simple way, without getting into too many details, because sometimes the details just bog us down and get us distracted, this means I watched it from items that could make it impure in a way that it could pass on impurity, but I didn't watch it from items or people or things that could make it impure itself without being able to pass on impurity. So that's why it has this in-between status of tehorami litameh. It's pure to pass on impurity because I watched it from all those items, but not mi leposla. But it is disqualified. And that's why it's posla lachila. You can't eat it again, assuming you only eat things that are tahol, like you're a prushi, so it would be impure. Now, the Gemara wants to know, is there such a thing? Mi'ika nitiruta lapaga. So we're totally off track. Again, I want to remind you why we're here so you don't forget. We brought these three cases of hesech hadad, of this lapse of attention. Then we said, but wait, you're going to say with the breads and all that. And if you're going to say with the breads that you thought it was wheat and it turned out barley, you're going to say it's tameh. Even if you do say that, you have a problem with this braita about the shemen and the yayin, where you thought it was wine, turned out it was oil. The halacha is that since you did watch it from thinking it was wine, you watched it at least to a certain extent. You're right. And what you watched it for, based on Rabbi Yirmiyah's explanation, actually worked. So we're still left with a question, because what you watched it to make sure nothing came in contact with it that could make it a level where it could actually pass on impurity. It's actually pure. Okay. Now it happens, it's disqualified because you didn't watch it from other things, but that shmirah worked. Okay. So theoretically, you should say that shmirah shouldn't have worked. It should be able to be considered maybe something came in contact with it that would make it a first degree impurity, which would then pass on to a second degree impurity because you had a lapse of attention. That's our basic question, but we're not going to get back there for a little while. So now the Gemara says, is there really such a thing that you could have partial, I watched it from these things and not from other things? So the Gemara says and I'm thinking about when you proofread, right? When you proofread, right? I'm thinking about this because our bookmarks were, Baruch Hashem, they were printed and they're on their way to people now. So hopefully you'll get them in a few days. Thank you, the Futornik family, for taking them all to America last night and going to ship them there. So special thank you. So when I proofread them, here's a good example. So you proofread and there are different elements on it. And you proofread, you have to kind of, when you do proofreading, I don't know if you ever proofread, but you kind of read it for one thing, and then you read it a second time, paying attention to other details, and then you pay, right? And if you don't pay, you can't pay attention to all those details all at once. So you can see the same thing with Shemara. I could watch for certain things, but not necessarily pay attention for all of the possible things. So the Gemara wants to know, is that really true? Is there such a thing? So which the Gemara says, yes, there is. And in fact, we're going to prove it from a braita. Tanya, it says in a braita, Hoshit yado besal. If I put my hand in a basket, v'hasal al ktefo, the basket's on my shoulder, v'hamagrefa b'toch hasal, there's a shovel in the basket, v'haya b'libo al hasal, v'lo haya b'libo al magrefa. I had protected the basket from getting contaminated, from getting impure, but I hadn't thought about the shovel. Hasal tahor v'magrefa tme'ah. So we say that the sal is pure because I was thinking about the sal, but the basket, but the shovel inside there is not, because I wasn't paying attention. Did something come in contact with the shovel? So the Gemara asks, when hasal tahol titamea magrefa l'sal, if the basket itself is impure and the shovel's in the basket, wouldn't the basket pass impurity to the shovel? So that's a very easy answer. In kli mitamei kli. No, Remember, how does a sal become impure? A sal, okay, this is good review, and then go back to your chart. A sal can come in contact, let's say a basket, it's a kli, a vessel, utensil. That can come in contact with avatuma. Avatuma can only make, right, vessels and humans can only be mitame by an av, okay, or an avi avotatuma. So if the vessel becomes impure from an avatuma, okay, like a nida touches it, becomes impure, it can only pass on impurity to food and drink, not to other vessels. So that's why if the sal became impure, it wouldn't be able to pass on impurity to another vessel within the basket. It would only pass on impurity if there's, let's say, fruits in the basket. So then the fruits would become tameh. So they say, ain't kli mitame kli. That's not a problem. V'litame masha b'sal. Well, maybe it should make all the fruits in the basket tameh. So Amar Ravina, ve'omer shmartiv midavar shemitam'o v'lo midavar haposlo. So the only reason to explain this, the only way to explain this situation is to say that it must be, 1 second, I just want to check one thing, right? It must be that it's where he said, I'm watching it from something that's mitam'o, but nami davar poslo. In other words, I watch this basket from something that might create secondary impurity to it. Now, there are ways, this is a little bit weird. We just said a kli can't become second impurity. There are ways, rabbinic ways, where it could become a second degree impurity, a vessel. That's ain't kli mitame kli. A vessel can't be mitame a vessel, but there is a way that a vessel could become second degree impurity, but not in a way that it could actually pass on impurity to anything else. And that's why it doesn't make what's inside the basket impure. Okay, so that was this braita, that in order to explain the braita, the only way to explain it was to do the same ukimta that Rabbi Yirmiyah gave on the other case, which means that obviously this is a thing, that one could split their how they watch things, what they watch it for, these things and not other things. Amal Ravina, Mikol Makom Kasha. Okay, so that was an aside about the source. In the end, they say, though, okay, that was just to explain why this wine and oil case has this split, where it could become impure, but not enough to pass on impurity. But now, how could it actually not be able to pass on impurity? That means your shmirah worked. There was no lapse of attention, which is a rejection, a question on all those three cases where we said lapse of attention means there's no impurity, right? You can't say you protected it from impurity. We have to assume it became impure. So now they say ve'od, and furthermore, we're going to have another question. And here we got a bit of a story. Motiv Rabba Bar Abba, he asked another question on these three rabbis and said, here's a bright. There was a woman who came before Rabbi Yishmael. And she said to him, Rabbi, okay, I was tahor the whole time. I woved, I weaved, I embroidered, whatever, I write this, I guess it's what I wove this cloth. Okay, now what happens? When you weave a cloth, at the beginning stages, you could be in nida, it doesn't really matter. Because why? Okay, or you could have some impurity upon you without it being an issue. Because until it becomes 3 by 3 fingers breadths, it's not considered significant. It only becomes susceptible to impurity, just like we talked about yesterday. Liquid has to come on fruits, right? That makes it important. The baguette has to be important. A cloth has to be significant to be used for something before it can create impurity. So she says, from the moment it was 3 by 3, right? I know I was Torah, nothing happened. Okay, so she wants to know, can I assume, okay, but what does she say? But I wasn't thinking about it the whole time. It's not like I had it in my head. I want to make sure to keep this cloth tahol, pure. No, I just know that nothing came in contact with it, but I wasn't thinking about it from the beginning. So Amra, she says to her, Amar Rabbi Yishmael, sorry, I lost my place. Sorry, not yet. Umitoch b'dikot shaya Rabbi Yishmael bodka. He starts asking her all these questions. Did you have any friends over? Did you, he starts asking questions after question. Amra lo Rebbe, nidam mashchai bechevel. Oh yeah, one day my friend came over. She was a nida, and she pulled some of the strings on the weaving loom, which means basically that moved. This is what's called tumat hesed. It means if she moves something, right? Like I move my elbow, it knocks my cup, which moves the cloth. Okay, so she was moving the some of the strings in the loom, and that might have pushed and moved, caused some movement in the cloth once it was already 3 by 3. Well, yeah, it's possible. To which he says, Amar Rabbi Yishmael, Kama gdolim divrei chachamim How wise are the words of the rabbis? Where the rabbi said, if you have it in your heart to protect it, then it will be protected. But if you didn't, like this woman, that's what happened. The woman came and said, well, I know, nothing tameh came in contact with it, but I wasn't watching it from the beginning. Well, if she was watching it from the beginning and had it in her mind, she would have made sure when this needed woman came into her house, she didn't touch the weaving loom, right? And when you asked her, she kind of forgot about it because it wasn't so significant in her eyes. But once he starts questioning her, she remembers. And then he says, you see, this is why they say you have to have it in your mind from the beginning. Now, what's the point here? The point is that because you had it in your mind, clearly, right, it would have worked if she had it in her mind. Okay, so there you see, even though maybe there was Hesed Hadad or something, right, it's not exactly the same kind of case, but it shows having it in your mind is enough. In some of these cases, having it in your mind was not enough, right? The item switches and it's a problem. Another case just like this. Shuv ma'aseh b'isha achat, another woman, Shabbat lefnei Rabbi Yishmael, amra lo Rebbe, mapazo artia b'tahara. Okay, again, a woman says, I did this b'tahara, all was good. But I wasn't thinking about it in my heart. Umitoch b'dikot shaya Rabbi Yishmael bodkai, starts asking her questions. Amra lo Rebbe, niman nifsekali kshartia b'peh. I had a problem with the string and I tied it with my mouth. Now, why is that important? Well, the saliva of a nida, okay, this comes from a pasuk in the Torah about a zav, and it applies as well to a nida and a zava and all that. The saliva is mitami, okay, high-level impurity. Now, what happened here? Why didn't you think that was significant? Because the saliva was on the string. Now, when it's just a string, right, thread, it's not tameh yet. It's not in the beged. But what happened? When she then sewed it into the cloth, and the cloth became 3 by 3, it could be the saliva was still there. Okay, it sounds a little gross, right? Or saliva, whatever, but could be it was still wet, in which case at that point it had saliva of a nida on the cloth when it was a cloth and it was tameh. So Amar Rabbi Yishmael, again, he said, Kama gdolim divrei chachamim shayu omrim b'libo l'shomro tahor and b'libo l'shomro tameh. Okay, so why is this case different than ours? So we have 2 questions against our case: the wine and the oil, which seems to be fine, even though something switched, and this case where it seems as long as you had it in your mind, it should work. So now we're going to go one by one. Bishlama Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok. Okay, so he was the one who said about the women in the bathhouse. Kol achat ve'achat omeret. Okay, again, this is what we call an ukimta. Why didn't that case work? Because it must be a case where each of the women said in their minds, Chavirti eshet am haaretz. They each thought that the other was an am haaretz. It doesn't matter what they actually were. It's just that each thought that the other was an am haaretz. Umascha da'ata mina. Now, what happens? If you notice that you're in the bathhouse and you realize, oh my God, my friend has my clothes and she's not careful about tum and tara, at that point, you give up on those clothes. You basically say, oh, they clearly weren't watched, which means if they clearly weren't watched, at this point, you're not going to watch them anymore because you give up on it, right? You're very careful about watching it. But as soon as you realize it's gone, right? There's no hope. Well, then you just don't care anymore. So that's why your level of shmirah dropped at that point, because even though she maybe was a chaver and she was watching it, at the point that you realize that things messed up, you basically give up on your high level protection because you would just assume it's a lost cause. So, right, we all know that, right? As soon as something's a lost cause, so you just let it go, right? I'm like something, oh, your shirt rips. Right? At that point, it's gone. So it doesn't really matter if it rips more. So you might not be careful and it'll, you shred the whole thing to pieces. Right? You just don't care at that point. So that's why it's no good, because she gave up on watching it. Same thing with the next case. The Rabbi Yonatan ben Amram Nami. Kevan de kelim de Shabbat avelu shimur tfei. Since you keep a very high level protection on your Shabbat clothing, as soon as you realized that you thought, right, that they were a big day, right? Again, what was the case? You thought they were regular clothes, and it turns out they were Shabbat clothes. So you realize you didn't give it the protection it deserved, right? And then you just give up on it again. Because you realize these are Shabbat clothes and I didn't protect them the way I normally protect my Shabbat clothes. Then you're like, okay, well, it's a lost cause. Okay, so both cases, there's this. Ella, the problem is, what about this Rabbi Yonatan ben Elazar case? What about him? Okay, what was his case? His case was where my headpiece fell, and I asked you to pick it up for me. And all along I was there. I didn't really stop thinking about it. It's not, right? There was no confusion. How would you explain that case? So now you could say, right, while it was in your hands, I was still watching it. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Chazaka ein adam shamer masha b'yad chaverov. There's an assumption that people don't watch what's in someone else's hands. To which the Gemara says below, really not? Why not? Turning out I'm a bet. V'hatanya. Doesn't it say in a Braita? If I sent my donkey rider and his workers to take my stuff that were all tahol, okay, my pure items on their donkey to carry it, even if I distance myself the distance of a meal, just close to a mile, you can still assume they're pure. Now, what does this show? Anything biyad chavero actually works, right? And here we're saying people don't watch Mash biyad chavero. So now we're going to have to see. We want to prove from here that people do watch, right? So we're going to say now, Chazaka ein adam mishamel, right? This sounds like you can watch, right? This goes against what we just said. We just said you don't watch what's in your friend's hands. So you do, because here, look, these guys are carrying it for him, and yet we still assume it's tahol, even though someone else is carrying his stuff. Okay, now, before we get to the answer, we have to read the rest of the source. He says, look, you go ahead and I'll catch up to you sometime later. Then, as soon as he doesn't see them anymore, okay, then it doesn't work anymore because he's not watching them. So now the Gemara says, what's the difference? So Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, it's not a matter of I see them and therefore I know and I can watch. No, the idea is he made them all, they were Amei Haaretz, but he made them all go through a purification process. So it doesn't matter if they touch them or not. They are pure, so there's nothing to worry about. To which the Gemara says, what do you mean? If there's nothing to worry about, he was matar all them, then what does it matter if he sees them or doesn't see them, right? The Seifa case doesn't work because he's far away from them, right? Where he says, I'm going to catch up to you in a while, and then we have to assume something happened. Well, if they were all purified, then what are we worried about is going to happen? Then the Seifa should be fine. We're going to have a ping pong back and forth. Every time we answer a question, we're going to say, what about the other case? What about the other case? If you let them go on their own and you're not anywhere near them, they might have their friends come and touch it. You might bump into a friend and the friend says, oh, what do you got in there? And they'll open the barrel of wine and they'll touch the wine. That's what you have to worry about, not them themselves. They themselves are tahor. That's why the ratio works. But their friend might touch them and that's a problem. Well, now back to the beginning. Maybe when they're walking, you're not walking alongside them. You're not watching the whole time either. So why in that case are we not worried their friends are going to touch them? So they say, Bebalahem derech hakalaton. It's where they're walking and he keeps popping up every few minutes on the side. So therefore, they're not going to let their friends touch it because they know at any moment the owner might show up and check up on them. Ihachi sefanami. Well, then the second case, it would be the same. No, that's exactly the difference. Since he says, go and I'm going to meet you later, they assume he's not showing up every 2 minutes and then they might let their friend touch it. And that's why the sefer doesn't work. The ratio works again. Why did we do this? The ratio works only because he purified them all. But if it was in the hands of a friend and he didn't know they were purified or right, and then you'd have to worry if once something's in your friend's hands, it's already hesech hadat. So now we've explained all those three cases. And with that, Hadran alach ein doshin, finished the second parak. We're now moving on to the third. Very similar to where we started in the previous Mishnah. We're even going to have a repeat of one of the halachot. Chomer b'kodesh mi-b'tchuma. We now get a whole listing, and we're not going to go into detail about this. We're going to go into detail, the Gemara over the next few dapim. I'm going to go into detail of these cases, but we'll just give a general explanation. There's certain ways that kodesh, which we know already, is more severe than truma, right? It's more strict. So we're going to have a whole long list. Matbilim kelim b'toch kelim l'truma, aval lo l'kodesh. If you have a kli inside another kli, and you put that kli in the mikvah, it becomes pure for the purposes of truma, but not for the purposes of sacrificial foods. That doesn't work. There's different parts of a vessel. There's the outside, there's the inside airspace, there's the handle. In truma, for truma purposes, let's say I have truma food that I want to put in this vessel. If the outside became impure, I could put stuff inside. Okay, those are treated, the handle, the outside, and the inside are each three separate parts. One part becomes tameh, it's not matame the whole thing. But avalo b'kodesh. B'kodesh, if the handle becomes impure, the whole thing is impure, the inside or the outside, everything. Any part of it becomes impure, we view the whole thing as impure. Hanosea tamidras, nosea tatruma. Midras, we said, is an avatuma. When I hold it, I'm a rishon. A rishon can only be mitame clothing. I'm sorry, food and drink, not clothing. Okay, not a kli. But while I'm holding this item that's tumat midras, while it's in my hand, if I can be no say truma, I can carry something that's truma, but not kodesh. Okay, it's going to make something that I'm carrying impure if it's like while I'm holding it, it has a higher level of, I can pass on impurity at a higher level, but only to kodesh, not to truma. This is a chumrah by kodesh, not by truma. Big day ochle truma midras lekodesh. Okay, this we already saw in the previous Mishnah. You have to wonder why they repeated it. The clothes of an ochle truma, right? They're careful about it for truma purposes, but it's not strict enough for those who are eating sacrificial foods. So it's considered trumat midras for them. Lo kimidata kodesh midata truma. This is a very weird phrase because it sounds like a summary thing, but we're actually in the center of the Mishnah. Some Tosfot asked this question. There's another commentary I saw that splits and says, well, the beginning of the Mishnah was, this is true for truma and not for kodesh. And now we're going to start saying, this is kodesh and not truma. And they try to make some distinctions. Anyway, we're going to keep going on. But so what's things that's not the same? Shebekodesh matil uminagev umatbil. Before you dunk something in the mikvah, some people think this is closed. You have to untie any knots in the clothing. Some people say we're talking about a vessel that's tied together. The parts of it are tied together. You have to untie all the parts and dip each part separately. And you have to dry it off from anything that might be on it. Can't be wet when it goes into the mikvah. It's a debate about what exactly you have to dry it from. Is it from dirt or from anything, like water even? If you want to tie it, we'll do it after it comes out of the mikvah. When it comes to truma, though, you could tie the knots before if you want. You don't have to, but you could tie them before and dunk it tight. We're not worried about what we call a chatzitza or some sort of separation. When you made the kli, everything like the woman who was weaving, right? Everything was done with impurity. Still, tzrichin tefillah lekodesh. You have to put it in a mikvah before you use it for sanctified, right? For sacrificial items, but not letruma. But since it was all done in impurity, you don't need to purify it before you eat truma. If I have a vessel and in it are a bunch of pieces of meat, and one of them became impure, even if it's not touching the other pieces, for kodesh, everything in there is impure because the kli brings everything together and it all has the same status. For truma, that's not the case. If it's one piece separate from the others, it doesn't pass on impurity. Haravi b'kodesh pasul, v'ashlishi b'truma, right? What is posel, right? What's the end game? The end game for kodesh is fourth degree, and the end game for truma is third degree. We talked about before that your hands might touch things, and rabbinically, right? Let's say I touch the Sefer Torah, my hands become a sheni latuma. But for truma, if one of my hands becomes impure, I only have to wash that one hand. For kodesh, I need to wash both. Because your hand passes on impurity to the other one for kodesh, but not for truma. Let's just explain it. If the foods were dry and never became susceptible to impurity, you can eat them for truma. It's not susceptible to impurity at all, but lo b'kodesh. Sacrificial meat is so important that you don't need, or sacrificial food, that you don't need water to get upon it or something like that. It's significant in and of its own right, and it can become susceptible to impurity right away. Okay, we'll end here. We'll start with the next case, the last case of the Mishnah tomorrow, because it appears on Daf Kaf Aleph. So with that, we'll finish our Daf. Have a great day, everybody.